And when you hear exactly what he experienced, you will understand why some encounters leave you with only one choice: surrender everything or lose yourself completely. This is a story about the moment when a man who thought he controlled the spiritual realm discovered he'd been controlled by it all along. For over 30 years, Emmanuel practiced traditional African witchcraft in his village. He wasn't just any witch doctor. He was considered one of the most powerful spiritual practitioners in his region, consulted by people from hundreds of miles away. Sick people got better, enemies fell ill, hidden things were revealed. His power seemed real, tangible, and utterly effective. But what Emmanuel didn't realize was that the source of his power would one day become the very thing he'd desperately want to escape. That's what most people do want to understand about practitioners of dark magic. They not faking it. The power is real. The experiences are genuine. But the source is something far more dangerous than most realize. Emmanuel knew he was communicating with spiritual entities. He could feel their presence, hear their voices, and see results that defied natural explanation. What he believed were ancestral spirits or nature deities were actually something much darker. The Bible speaks clearly about this reality. Deuteronomy warns against divination, sorcery, and consulting with spirits. Not because these practices are fake, but because they're real and connect people to demonic forces masquerading as helpful guides. Emmanuel's power came at a cost he didn't fully understand. He experienced nightmares, spiritual oppression, and a growing emptiness that no amount of money or respect could fill. The entities he served demanded more and more. Certain rituals required blood sacrifices. Others required him to spend nights in graveyards or isolated forests. His marriage suffered. His children grew distant, afraid of what they sometimes saw in their home. The power that once made him feel invincible was slowly consuming him from the inside out. It happened on an ordinary night. Emmanuel had performed a particularly draining ritual earlier that day and fell asleep exhausted in his home. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. In his dream, he found himself in a place he'd never seen before. The atmosphere was different from any spiritual experience he'd ever had. There was light, but not from the sun. There was presence, but not the dark, heavy feeling he was used to. Then he saw him, a figure clothed in white, radiating an authority that made every spirit Emmanuel had ever worked with seem like powerless shadows. Emmanuel knew immediately, without being told, that this was Jesus Christ. Not as a distant religious figure, but as a living, powerful presence standing before him. The moment their eyes met, Emmanuel felt something he'd never experienced in 3 decades of spiritual practice. Absolute, unconditional love mixed with terrifying holiness. Jesus didn't speak with words at first. His presence communicated everything. Emmanuel saw his entire life flash before him, every ritual, every spell, every person he'd harmed through his practice. But instead of condemnation, he felt an overwhelming invitation to freedom. Then Jesus spoke, and his voice carried an authority that made the ground beneath Emmanuel's feet tremble. "Come out of darkness. I am the way, the truth, and the life." Emmanuel woke up physically shaking, covered in sweat, tears streaming down his face. But these weren't tears of fear. They were tears of recognition. For the first time in his life, he understood that everything he'd built was a lie. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because it was connected to the wrong source. The entities he'd served for decades suddenly felt exposed for what they truly were. Deceiving spirits that had enslaved him while pretending to empower him. The conviction was immediate and overwhelming. He couldn't go back to his practice even if he wanted to. The very thought of touching his ritual objects made him physically ill. He spent the rest of that night praying, something he'd never genuinely done before. He cried out to the Jesus he'd encountered in his dream, asking for forgiveness, for freedom, for a complete transformation. And that's when he knew what he had to do. Everything had to go. When dawn broke, Emmanuel gathered his family and told them everything. Then he began the process of destroying his entire spiritual inventory. Masks that were worth thousands of dollars, some passed down through generations. Potions made from rare ingredients that took years to acquire. Ceremonial objects that people had offered him fortunes to obtain. Books filled with incantations and spiritual formulas. Animal bones used in divination. Charms and amulets that protected his compound. For context, in his rural African village, that was more money than most families would see in a lifetime. It was his retirement fund, his children's inheritance, his insurance policy, and he burned it all without hesitation. But Emmanuel's decision didn't come without consequences. The entities he'd served for decades didn't release him quietly. In the weeks that followed, he experienced spiritual attacks unlike anything he'd faced before. Nightmares intensified. He heard voices threatening him, warning him that he'd made a terrible mistake. Objects in his house moved. His health declined rapidly. This is the reality that people who leave occult practices often face. The spiritual realm is real, and when someone breaks covenant with dark forces, there's resistance. But Emmanuel had something he never had before. He had Jesus. Every time the attacks intensified, he prayed. He found a local church and was baptized. He began reading the Bible, and the words that once seemed foreign now felt like living water to his soul. Slowly, the attacks diminished. The nightmares stopped. His health returned. But more than that, the emptiness that had plagued him for years was replaced with a peace he couldn't explain. The power he once wielded through fear was replaced with a power that came through love. The change in Emmanuel was impossible to ignore. His countenance changed. The darkness that once seemed to hover around him lifted. His marriage was restored. His children, who had been terrified of their father's spiritual activities, began to trust him again. He smiled genuinely for the first time in years. But the most powerful testimony came from those who had been his clients. People who had paid him to curse their enemies came back, not for more spells, but asking what had happened to him. Former fellow witch doctors watched from a distance, some mocking, others secretly curious. A few even reached out privately, asking if what they heard was true. Emmanuel became bold about his testimony. He didn't hide what he'd been or what he'd done. He spoke openly about the darkness he'd served and the Jesus who had set him free. Satanists, New Age channelers, voodoo priests, shamans, and psychics have encountered Jesus Christ and experienced radical transformation. Their stories share common elements: a genuine supernatural encounter, immediate conviction, the destruction of their spiritual tools, spiritual warfare during their transition, and eventually, profound peace and freedom. These testimonies matter because they reveal something our modern skeptical world tries to deny. The spiritual realm is absolutely real. There really are powers of darkness, and there really is a power of light that is infinitely greater. Jesus isn't just a historical figure or religious teacher. He is actively present, actively reaching into the darkest places, actively calling people out of bondage. Emmanuel's $50,000 sacrifice wasn't about the money. It was about the statement it made. When you encounter something truly priceless, everything else loses its value. When you find true power, counterfeit power becomes worthless. When you meet the real Jesus, everything else becomes negotiable. Emmanuel's life today looks completely different. He travels throughout his region sharing his testimony, warning people about the reality of dark spiritual forces and introducing them to the Jesus who set him free. He's helped dozens of others leave occult practices. He's seen marriages restored, families healed, and entire communities impacted by the power of his testimony. But perhaps the most powerful part of his story is this: he has no regrets. Not about the $50,000. Not about the status he lost. Not about the career he destroyed. When people ask him if it was worth it, his answer is always the same: I traded darkness for light, slavery for freedom, and death for life. I would do it again 1,000 times. The question Emmanuel's story raises isn't whether spiritual power is real. His decades of practice proved that it is. The question is, which power will you serve? The power that demands everything and gives you emptiness, or the power that gave everything and offers you fullness? If Emmanuel's story resonates with you, if you're involved in any spiritual practice that leaves you feeling empty, oppressed, or spiritually bound, there is freedom available. The same Jesus who met Emmanuel in a dream is still reaching out to people today. His invitation hasn't changed. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I want to hear from you in the comments. Has this story impacted you? Do you know someone who needs to hear this testimony? Share your thoughts below. And if this video opened your eyes to something you've never considered before, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. These are the stories that need to be told, the testimonies that remind us that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how deep into darkness you've gone, the light is always brighter. Always.